Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and I think we're going to have a really fun discussion today. So we have a list that is hinting at some secret Nintendo Switch 2 titles where we do have several leaks involved here. And once we fill in all the gaps, I think it's actually going to be giving us some pretty significant insight as to what to expect from Nintendo over the next year or so. So it's some pretty cool fun stuff here. I'm excited to get into today's discussion. But before doing so, quick reminder here, I do have this goal to reach 60,000 subscribers. We're getting really close. So if you find yourself enjoying my videos and you haven't subscribed already, I would very much appreciate your subscription, and liking and commenting also help a lot too. But getting into things here, a couple days ago, Central Leaks shared out this list. And what this list is a list of different Switch 2 titles with their product codes. So if you look at a Switch 2 cartridge, you will see certain letters here, right? Like if you look at Donkey Kong Bonanza, the Donkey Kong Bonanza cartridge, it's going to have this text right here, the 3 A's, a C, and then an A. And so as you'll notice, this is a list that has some blanks. You'll even notice Pokemon Winds and Waves. So Central Leaks appears to be sharing some information from the Terra Leak. For those that don't know, the Terra Leak is basically when we got all this leaked information about internal plans from Pokemon Company and Game Freak. Like we saw a whole bunch of test footage for different Pokemon games. We saw leaked documentation for future plans, for a whole bunch of different stuff, for not just the games, but merchandising, the movies, the anime, all that stuff. And from this Terra Leak stuff, we've come to understand a lot of things about Pokemon Winds and Waves before it was even revealed, and a lot of that's already been confirmed, which is not surprising because it was legitimately leaked information that was completely 100% obvious because it was leaked footage and documentation that we could look at. But anyway, it appears that Central Leaks is sharing some information from the Terra Leaks here, not just the product codes, but also that these games start in development from 2021. We've heard about these things here. But this is why it's a big deal. With this information in mind, and also considering other leaks we understand and things we've heard about, and just public information based off interviews and stuff, we might actually be able to fill in these gaps for other Nintendo Switch 2 titles, which may then help us to understand what is coming next within the next year or so. Not just 2026, but perhaps some things in 2027 as well. What this would be indicating to us is when these different titles start development for Switch 2. And so Winds and Waves started development in 2021, and so they've been in development all this time. We're in 2026, they're coming out in 2027. So a lot of these games that started development early on a few years back, a handful of years back, would be getting finished up around now and coming out around now. Mario Kart World, Kirby Air Riders, Donkey Kong Bonanza were the first titles that started development specifically for Switch 2 and have already come out. Now some of you might be confused because we understand that both Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza started development very early on into the Switch 1 generation. Yes. However, they transitioned over to Switch 2 development a few years later. So, for example, here we see with Mario Kart World, this is the official Ask Developer page interview for Mario Kart World, and it's explained that development for Mario Kart World started actually March 2017. They began prototyping after Mario Kart Deluxe came out, right, or when it was about to come out. But if we scroll down here to the bottom of this page, you'll see here that Yabuki explains, "We worked on it while kicking the can down the road in terms of deciding what to give up on. So at some point, we knew it was going to get messy. But as we decided to release Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Course Pass, we thought that would give us a bit more time to continue development. That's when the conversation of moving it to the Nintendo Switch 2 system came up, and this suddenly opened up a bunch of possibilities on what we could do. It was truly a ray of hope." So basically, they had a lot of ambition for Mario Kart World, and they were trying to find a way to make it work on Switch 1, but they were having a lot of issues. Eventually, in 2020, they decided to begin developing the Booster Course Pass for Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and so since Switch 1 was going to be getting the Booster Course Pass on top of the base game Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, they figured they can transition development of Mario Kart World over to Switch 2 as an exclusive. So this happened in 2020. Going back to the list, the very first Switch 2 title, Mario Kart World, this began development in 2020. Now, with Kirby Air Riders, we actually understand, because Sakurai told us about this secret project way back, that he actually began around summer of 2021. So Kirby Air Riders started development, the early part of it, the pre-development phase, 2021. And then Donkey Kong Bonanza, looking here, they tell us that it also began in 2021. So these games, 2020, 2021, these titles came out. Now we have a blank one here. I'm going to get to the blank ones in a moment, but I want to explain the entire list so we have all the proper context to understand what is going on. So we already understand based on the Terra leaks that Pokemon Winds and Waves started development also in 2021, right? So what that tells us is that all these titles here likely also began development specifically for Switch 2 in 2021. But then looking beyond Pokemon Winds and Waves, I think these are titles that possibly could have started development in 2022, like these two blanks right here. Dragon Drive, we actually understand, started development in 2023. When we take a look at this creator's voice, this Ask Developer series for Dragon Drive, they explained here that it was 2 years ago when they started prototyping. This interview took place in 2025, last year. So yeah, Drag Drive started development in 2023. And so, in other words, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have 8 unannounced titles, or rather, titles that we do not know the product code for yet, for Nintendo Switch 2 that began development in either 2021, 2022, or in 2023 before Drag Drive. Now, as you see, there's more, but I'm not going to even bother with those because I'm not even sure about those. But what I am going to attempt to do here is fill in the blanks for these 8 titles here. So, firstly, we understand that the Dustbloods also started development as a Switch 1 title and transitioned over to Nintendo Switch 2. As it said right here, at first it was being worked on by a small team as a title for Nintendo Switch. However, just as the game started to take shape, we were approached by Nintendo with talk of Switch 2, which led us to revamp our development path with this new hardware in mind. And so I think it's probably the case that the Dustbloods is also one of those early titles that transitioned over to Nintendo Switch 2. It's possible this transition happened after Pokemon Winds and Waves or even after Drag Drive. It's possible, but the Dustbloods is a pretty significant title, and it's not necessarily just first-party titles that began development so early on, as we see Street Fighter 6 here. I will say though, I do believe most of the titles here are first-party Nintendo titles or some sort of exclusive, because that's what we're seeing here. Most of them are, so probably most of them are just that. Also, if we're talking about a third-party game that was prepped early on for Switch 2, it's already come out already. And so, given that we don't know about it yet and it's not here, then yeah, probably most of these are going to either be Nintendo titles or exclusives for Switch 2 that have not come out yet, like the Dustbloods. Like, taking a look here, Central Leaks actually shares like a list of the things we already know about, and as you see here, here's a whole bunch of different third-party titles that came out in the first few months of Switch 2, which speaks to my point. Anyways, I think there's a really strong chance that the Dustbloods is on this list, maybe for this second blank here. But what would be the first blank? Well, I'm going to speculate that it would be 3D Mario. Now, some people might point out, oh, well, Donkey Kong Bonanza was made by the Mario Odyssey team, therefore 3D Mario is many years away. This argument always comes up, and until it's proven or confirmed, I'm sure the argument will continue, but I'm just going to say it for the millionth time. You look at history, there has never been a Nintendo console that has gone more than 2 holidays into its generation without having a new mainline Mario platformer. So I'm going to rely on history here. Also, we know, like, factually, that key members of the Mario Odyssey team were not in the credits for Donkey Kong Bonanza. Like, over here, I Control F Koizumi, and there is no Koizumi. This is the only person that has a name with K-O-I. There's no Koizumi in the credits for Donkey Kong Bonanza, to speak to my point here. So I would assume that Nintendo's been developing 3D Mario for a long while, and they probably started developing it for Switch 2 around 2021, actually. That makes a lot of sense. You want to know what also came out in 2021? Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, that new 3D Mario experience. That was probably what they were tinkering with to give us some other sort of new 3D Mario experience beyond just Mario Odyssey. and afterwards they transitioned over to making a proper 3D Mario for Switch 2. This seems to add up here because we also look at Mario Tennis Fever. This is made by Camelot, and the last time they released a title was 2021, which it kind of makes sense. They would have started development for Mario Tennis Fever in 2021, which is implied here, so they started shortly after they released their prior Mario Sports title. But with this idea in mind, looking at when certain developers finished one project, suggesting when they would transition over to developing their next, let's consider what would come out in these gaps right here. I'll come back to the middle gaps in a moment. So Next Level Games put out Mario Strikers back in 2022, so you would think they would go all hands on deck basically for their next project after the release for Mario Strikers. So titles that may have began development in 2022 would likely fit somewhere in this gap right here, because Drag Drive started development in 2023 and these were still 2021, but still later than all these other 2021 projects. And so we've been theorizing the Next Level Games is working on Luigi's Mansion 4. Typically they take 3 years to come out with titles, which if that pattern continued, they would have actually had something ready for last year, but they didn't, which just kind of strengthens the idea that they have to be pretty close with their next project. The Luigi's Mansion series is their best-selling title that they've worked on, so I think likely they are working on Luigi's Mansion 4. It makes sense to have something like that ready early on. Plus also, there is the rumor from Special Nick, who has a really good track record in terms of Nintendo stuff, that there is like a Luigi's Mansion amiibo, Luigi with a poltergust, which I do think strongly suggests that if there's an amiibo like that coming out soon, that there's actually like a Luigi's Mansion game coming out. So presumably Luigi's Mansion 4, which I'm going to slot right here in the bottom 8th spot here. Now, what would be the 7th spot? Well, thinking about titles that likely began development around 2022, how about Splatoon Raiders? Splatoon 3 came out when? 2022. So this next entry in the Splatoon series, there's a decent chance they started shortly after the release for Splatoon 3. So I wouldn't be surprised if that is the title that fits into this 7th spot right here, Splatoon Raiders. But you see, what's interesting about Splatoon Raiders, there's this huge focus on the setting of the Spiralite Islands. And there are actually these different codename leaks, more than half of which have been confirmed already, and there's just a couple more remaining that we're waiting to see confirmation on. One of them is Project Spiral, which many seem to agree likely was a codename for Splatoon Raiders. We don't have full-on confirmation yet, but it seems pretty likely that that's the case. Now, I bring up these codenames though because there were others. Like, for example, there was a codename for Silver Star, and when we got that codename at the time, I extrapolated that that meant that there was going to be a new 3D Donkey Kong game made by the Odyssey team. And, well, guess what was confirmed? Donkey Kong Bonanza, a 3D Donkey Kong game made by the Odyssey team, or at least a lot of the members from the Odyssey team. The idea behind it being that Star, there was actually Project Red Star, which was for Super Mario Odyssey. Typically, the mainland Mario titles have Red in the codename, but Star had to do with Odyssey, so Silver Star, I thought the Star part was something based off the Odyssey engine, but the Silver part suggested not a Mario game, but something else. Silver, as in maybe like a silverback gorilla, Donkey Kong. I connected the dots and, well, at least I was correct for that particular theory. But anyway, there's still a few other codenames that have yet to have been confirmed. Project Legacy, which is said to be a Monolith Soft title, and that naming convention has nothing to do with the Xenoblade codenames, which seems to fuel the theory of that new IP that Monolith Soft was recruiting for since the beginning of the Switch 1 era, actually. But we do have job listings showing that there were people working on an action game for Switch 1 at Monolith Soft as of January 2021. So this would be for Switch 1, but we understand that if they transition development over to Switch 2, that would change, right? So it's possible that they transition development in 2021 still. So I'm just going to guess that Project Legacy fits in here for this third space. But reminder, please don't assume that I'm going to be 100% right here. There might be a little bit of flexibility here, although I do kind of feel like I'm probably fairly close. Codename Anna. What we understand of this one, it's made by the team that made Switch Sports, and the codenaming convention suggested it would be a follow-up to Switch Sports in some way, because the codename for Switch Sports was Elsa, so Anna, Elsa, the sisters from Frozen, so that's kind of like the idea. Maybe this is like a Switch Sports 2, a Switch Sports Resort. Some people are speculating we could be getting like a Switch Sports Nintendo Switch 2 edition, and maybe that's possible, but if you'll notice, we don't have any Switch 2 editions listed here. I believe those have different product codes. Actually, I can confirm that. I'm looking at my Switch 2 edition for Metroid Prime 4, and it starts with a B, not an A. So if Project Anna ends up just being a Switch 2 edition with new content, then it probably wouldn't be a part of this list, but I'm going to include it here because I feel like Project Anna is suggestive of not just a Switch 2 edition, but like a new entry in the series. But then that leaves us with 2 more gaps right here. And so what other titles might have started development around 2021? Well, Metroid Dread came out in 2021, and so whatever Nintendo Mercury Steam would have decided to make next for the 2D Metroid series, they probably assumed it would be a Switch 2 title, and so maybe this next spot here would be for the next 2D Metroid, which, by the way, we've been having conversations lately about what that might be. There are rumors that it's going to be a Super Metroid remake. Regardless of whether it's a Super Metroid remake or a sequel to Metroid Dread, it seems likely that the next 2D Metroid started development shortly after release for Metroid Dread for Switch 2, which would suggest it's likely pretty close to completion and could be coming out soon, and yeah, I think it would be slotted around here. Now, considering the last spot here, at first I wasn't sure what this last spot might be. I thought, Nintendo really does need to be working on something Zelda, but we know that Fujibayashi, the Zelda director, already talked about he had some ideas after the development of Tears of the Kingdom back in 2023, so in my opinion, they probably didn't actually start developing in earnest for the next open-air Zelda until, well, 2023, if not even later. So that's kind of what I'm thinking there. That Zelda project would be after Dragon Drive. Now, some people might bring up, well, what about a Zelda remake? We've been theorizing about that for a very long time. Is it possible that that is maybe what would be here? And yeah, I think it's possible that that could be the case, but let's remind ourselves it is a theory, right? So that means it's not necessarily going to be proven true. And even if it is, we don't know when it would have started development. We do have that Game Informer interview that came out late into 2023 where Aonuma was asked point blank about a modern Ocarina of Time remake, and he laughed and said no comment. He didn't deny the possibility of it when he had denied the possibility of other things during that time, such as a Zelda Dungeon Maker game. So things like that do give me confidence that they are working on something like this, but maybe they wouldn't have started it until late 2023, so probably after Dragon Drive, so not in these first 8 slots here. What I think it actually is a game that I've forgotten to mention that's already been announced. Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave. Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave is coming out this year. That likely took some years. You would have to think it was one of the earlier Switch 2 titles. Maybe they would only have a 3-year turnaround for this, and that's another title that started development in 2023. It's possible, but I think it's unlikely. I think it's probably taken even longer than that. It's going to be a pretty significant release. If this is kind of like the spiritual successor to Three Houses, then this is actually a very big game. And they probably started this at the very latest early 2023 because that's when Fire Emblem Engage came out, but we actually understand that Fire Emblem Engage was rated well beforehand, so odds are Fortune's Weave started development at the latest 2022, maybe even 2021, which would position it around here. So I'm going to slot in Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, which completes our list. Now, some people might bring up, well, what about Yoshi and the Mysterious Book? Why isn't that listed here? Yoshi and the Mysterious Book is a game that wouldn't have a long development time. Goodfield put out Princess Peach Showtime in 2024. I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't start Yoshi and the Mysterious Book until 2024. Even if they started before Princess Peach Showtime came out, this game wouldn't have a 4-year, 5-year development cycle. That's unlikely. It's a very small, simple game. The Goodfield games have very quick turnarounds, the Yoshi games. So, no, Yoshi Mysterious Book is not a part of these first 8 slots here, in my opinion. And with that in mind, I'll also point out, for those that are wondering about any other titles, there are a whole bunch of titles that I'm sure Nintendo's going to have ready to come out even this year that haven't been announced yet. but they wouldn't be titles that have had that long of a turnaround. They maybe started development in 2023 or 2024. Maybe something like a Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Definitive Edition or a 2D Zelda remake. Things like that wouldn't have as long of a development cycle, so something like that could fit into this year beyond what's already being suggested, things like maybe Splatoon Raiders, 3D Mario, Luigi's Mansion 4. With that all said though, I feel pretty good about this list, and I think this suggests some pretty exciting stuff. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.